Diabolique is a surprisingly influential film. I think a lot of people who are coming to it fresh now won't quite realize just how innovative it was in 1955, how much of a shock it was, and how much it changed everything. Because one of the things about influential films is that everybody imitates them. So you get this problem that everybody has taken so much from Diabolique that you see it now, you think, oh, well, this bit's from that and this bit's from that. But this is where it all comes from. Diabolique is the first big film to be built around a twist ending. It's the first film that you watch for 2 hours thinking you're seeing one story and that you understand the relationships and who's doing what to whom. And then at the end, there's a reversal and you realize that you've been misled all along, that you haven't understood what was happening and that actually something worse was happening. In the end, it's a conspiracy story. You sort of think back in your mind to what you've seen and you fill in the gaps.
Calme-toi, mon chéri. Tu sais bien que ça ne te vaut rien.
Je pouvais crever pour de bon et ne plus le voir.
Va, crève, ma chérie, crève bien vite.
Before, we'd had stories about couples trying to kill a spouse. Double Indemnity is a famous one. And there was also this tradition, which I think of associate with Patrick Hamilton's Gaslight, the husband who's trying to either kill the wife or drive the wife mad by horribly tormenting her in sort of subtle, nasty, domestic ways. Dial M for Murder was another one that was immediately before Diabolique. What Diabolique did was take this story and hide it. This is what's actually going on in Diabolique, is the husband is trying to kill the wife. But you don't realize that until almost the last scene. You think you're watching a story of a wife who believes she has killed the husband and then maybe is being haunted by a ghost. But that's not the actual story. Because he was working in France, which didn't have the same kind of censorship standards that America did, the husband here, Michel, is exponentially worse than even Charles Boyer or Anton Walbrook in both versions of Gaslight, because we have a real sense that Christina is being sort of emotionally, physically, and sexually abused endlessly to the point when it's amazing she's even survived. But there's something about the way it's wedded here to this sort of perverse, intertwined menage a trois, because you have the relationship between the wife and the mistress. I think that's something American cinema couldn't do then. There were film noir that depended on their complicated and abstruse plotting, but not in this particular way. The closest equivalent would be an American writer like Cornell Woolrich, who wrote Rear Window, for instance, and The Bride Wore Black and Phantom Lady. But those tend to depend on surprises rather than twists. Whereas Diabolique is constructed in the way classical mystery writers like Agatha Christie or John Dixon Carr constructed. It's written backwards. It's written perfectly. It's not made up as you go along in the way that Chandler writes, or even Hammett, actually, where you have lots of weird things happening, and then at the end, it's all kind of explained and tied together, but you don't really follow it. And you do have a sense that the writer is just, tidying all the loose ends away and throwing them out the window. Here, it's obviously constructed entirely around its plot. I think it goes back to the novelists. I think it's a Boileau Narcejac trait, because it's the kind of plotting that filmmakers are always impatient with. And I think that's because most film directors don't think in those story terms, which most mystery writers do, because they're used to the nitpicking of the average mystery reader, where you have to design something that is so perfectly constructed, that's so intricate and answers all your questions. And I think that Clouzot was very lucky to inherit that. He certainly builds on it and he adds a lot to the material that's not in the novel. He makes it grotesquely funny, whereas the novel is just purely a misery machine. Yeah, but I think that was an innovation. It raised the game of what audiences expected from a thriller, but also what they were willing to put up with. A couple of years earlier, Hitchcock had made a movie called Stage Fright, which he felt had been rejected by the audience because it had a device that's now commonplace. There's a flashback in it, which is a lie, where a character tells you something that didn't happen, but it is depicted on screen. And in 1951, audiences got up and said, you can't do that. Now, almost every film does do that. We're used to, sort of Rashomon versions in mysteries where you get to see everybody doing it and then pick who you think it was. Whereas there's something about Diabolique which does enable an audience to go along with it. And I think it's because it doesn't lie visually, maybe lies through omissions, but everything you see on screen actually does happen.
La nappe maintenant.
And all the inexplicable stuff is just off the edges of the frame. But because audiences were willing to accept that, that meant that a whole area of what you can do in a mystery was now opened up and would then, frankly, endlessly be recycled. In the early 1950s, Alfred Hitchcock was already established as the master of suspense. And he'd had the hits like Strangers on a Train, Rear Window, all of which had kind of confirmed him as like the absolute king of what he did. And then this French filmmaker came along and he had The Wages of Fear, which everybody said was like the most suspenseful film ever made. Although it's wrong to call it an action movie, it's kind of a high adventure film in a way that wasn't really trespassing on what Hitchcock did. But Diabolique was, and I think Hitchcock saw this as a challenge. I mean, apparently he wanted to buy the book. He then turned around and bought the author's next book. I think Vertigo is his attempt to do something bigger and better and more colorful and richer and deeper than Diabolique. Although we now hail it as a masterpiece, was commercially not a huge success and also critically wasn't much liked. And so he may have felt that Clouseau had beaten him in that. And you have a feeling that for a good 5-10 years, he had Diabolique in his mind. And I think there was a certain frustration that he couldn't make a film like that because he was working in America. But there was also just a sense that he had missed a boat. Yeah, it's somebody else had come along and scored in the field that he felt was particularly his. And so he turns around and makes Psycho. And Psycho is the film that, at least temporarily, blots out the reputation of Diabolique. Oddly enough, they both use the same selling line. Hitchcock says it in a more charming and a more funny way, and both of them stole it from Agatha Christie's The Mousetrap. It's, don't give away the ending. It's the only one we've got. I think even the fact that the big horror scene in Psycho takes place in a bathroom was something that appealed to Hitchcock, because it's a way of saying, you thought that bathroom scene in Diabolique was scary. You haven't seen anything. Wait for the shower scene in Psycho. Although Clouseau made other films, some quite interesting, he never did come back. He was not committed to genre in the way that Hitchcock was. He may also not have been as committed to his own reputation in the way that Hitchcock was. Hitchcock, of course, introduced his own TV series. How many other film directors have their own theme tune? Clouseau wasn't able to compete with that. But I think you can say that later Hitchcock wouldn't have been Hitchcock without Diabolique to kind of give him a kick. Diabolique was an instantaneous success. And across the board, it had great reviews and it had great audiences. I mean, obviously a big hit in France, but perhaps more significantly, big hit in Britain and in America. It was a film that people went to see beyond, the art house circuit. And I think there was a sense at the time that filmgoers were being a bit more adventurous about what they'd go and see, but also that they were finding that territories other than Hollywood were producing entertaining films. Yeah, it wasn't the sense that you were going to a foreign film because it was good for you. There was a run of French gangster films in the 1950s. Rififi was the most famous and the biggest crossover success of those. But Diabolique showed that France could do another type of thriller too, this sort of quiet domestic thriller. But it's also distinctive. It was sold as a suspense picture, and it was sold as kind of sexier than British or American films. And so, therefore, it had a huge commercial impact. And one of the things that meant is lots and lots of people started imitating it, and not just sort of one-off auteurs like Hitchcock with Psycho, like Robert Aldrich with Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, which is practically the same story as Diabolique, or Curtis Harrington with Games, who even casts Simone Signoret and pays homage to the plot of Diabolique in a sort of playful way. But people like William Castle, the great Schlockmeister, the gimmick king, he saw that Diabolique had many lessons to be learned. And a whole bunch of his films have similar twist endings or similar setups of people trying to murder their wives, or people you thought were the hero are actually the villain. They all have many, many elements of Diabolique. In history, you've tended to forget that because they're seen as imitations of Psycho, because Psycho is a more lingeringly famous film. In Britain, Hammer Films, who made their reputation with horror pictures in the late 50s, they seemed almost obsessed with doing homages to Diabolique in really peculiar ways. My favorite of these, where the poster line is literally a diabolical new technique in suspense. And it's like the mad folding thing. If you put your hand over, you've got diab at one side and eek at the end of technique. And there it is on the poster, reminding you of the film they're trying to imitate. And all the imagery of Diabolique turns up again and again throughout the 1960s in psycho thrillers. Things like stagnant swimming pools, the lights that come on in the abandoned Gothic building with the figure flitting between the windows, the fragile heroine in the nightgowns of wandering down the corridor and having that striking heart attack. Many, many more scenes set in bathrooms. I mean, Hitchcock wasn't the only person to decide that the bathroom was the scariest room in the house. When they first start remaking it, which I think the first one is Reflection of Murder, a 1972 TV movie with Tuesday Weld in the lead, it's all been used up. Every single aspect of the original film has been done over and over again. That the remake is almost fresh, because it's in color and actually looks a bit different. And it's been done twice since then. And there's a movie with Kate Vernon and Bruce Boxleitner, and there's the very ill-conceived Jeremiah Chechik, Sharon Stone, Isabella Gianni, Chaz Palminteri version, Diabolique, which strangely is perfectly cast, looks great, but has maybe the worst ending ever put on a mystery thriller. Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte is the most elaborate of the American remakes. It is based on a story by Henry Farrell, but let's face it, it's based on Diabolique. Hush Hush actually has a happy ending, sort of, in that she's not dead, whereas an American film at that time couldn't go as far as Clouseau did.
Aval.
C'est pas ma faute. Ça passe pas.
Aval.
There is something about seeing somebody being persecuted that, even if it's not particularly well done, gets you on side. And I think that very few people watching Diabolique lose sympathy with Christina because she's a murderess or thinks she's a murderess, because the husband is so loathsome that you would have to be the staunchest moralist to say that no, she shouldn't drown him in the tub. So the last hour of that, you are completely on side. And I think that's true of all the great versions of this story. It's, you go through an emotional wringer with the victim character. It was one of those films where people would years later say, what was the film with? And they'd always remember the guy in the bath. I don't think people had ever seen anyone remove contact lenses on screen before. And it's done in such kind of ritualistic, gruesome, gloating way. Moments like that stayed in people's minds for decades. And they may have forgotten some of the details of the plot, but that kind of impact lasts. It became one of those films that is a part of popular culture.